Hello, class, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 2. Right now, we're going to do a little survey of microorganisms. Later on in chapters, we're going to get into more detail, but we're just going to discuss the main key players in microbiology. So to start off with, we're going to talk about bacteria. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about bacteria, and we will be researching bacteria in the laboratory setting. Bacteria are prokaryotic. So again, pro means before, kary means nucleus. Usually they are unicellular, so they're a one-cell organism, and they lack a nucleus as well as they lack membrane-bound organelles. So you're not going to see a Golgi apparatus or a rough endoplasmic reticulum or mitochondria for that instance. They do have ribosomes. They will have DNA. Usually they're much smaller than eukaryotes. And when we think about their DNA, it's usually single cell, or it's a singular chromosome that we're going to see, and it's in a circular shape. Usually they are found anywhere and everywhere. We call them ubiquitous, especially if they have sufficient moisture. And they're going to produce what we call by binary fission, where a parent cell will be able to create two identical daughter cells. And so this is going to be an asexual reproduction. When we discuss a bacteria, not only do they have a cell membrane, they also have a cell wall. And most bacteria are going to have a cell wall that's composed of peptidoglycan. The term peptidoglycan you will hear quite a bit. In fact, this is what will help us in gram staining to determine whether or not a bacteria is gram positive or gram negative. Again, not all bacteria have a peptidoglycan cell wall, but the majority of them do. And there are even bacteria that can live in really extreme environments, such as very high salt concentrations, very cold temperatures, very hot temperatures. They can be what are known as acidophiles, where they like high acidity or low pH. Or on the flip side, they could be where they like very high pH and be called an alkalinophile, where they like more basic environments. They are quite old. They have been thought to be on the Earth for about 3.5 billion years. And again, they're found almost anywhere. You can find them at the bottom of the sea. You can find them in cold glacier areas. We can find them in our mouth. They are pretty much anywhere that you can think of. And usually the largest biomass on Earth. But believe it or not, as many bacteria as we know, we believe that it's only about less than 1% have actually been grown in a lab. So there's just a lot of unknowns when it comes to bacteria. And then here's just a picture to sort of see those differences. What we are actually looking at here is these guys. These are your bacteria in comparison to a eukaryotic cell. So they are quite a bit different in sizes. Eukaryotic organisms are going to be much bigger. And so that's what we're going to see here. And then those tiny littler cells are your bacterial cells. And we'll talk more about detail coming up later on. When we describe bacteria, we talk about their cell morphology and their arrangements. So we look at their shape as well as their arrangement. In terms of shapes, there's three basic shapes. You're going to hear of a coccus or cocci. So if you heard of Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, that means they're spherical shapes. When we discuss in a little bit more detail the idea of a Streptococcus, you're going to see circular shape in sort of a chain-like fashion. And for Staphylococcus, we see them in these grape-like clusters. For Bacillus, this is going to be your rod shape that we're going to see. So if we look at E. coli, they look like tiny little rods. For spherical, it could be like a spirillum or a spirochete. And then we're going to hear about some other shapes as well, like a vibrio is more comma-like shape. A cocobacillus is going to be a very blunt rod shape. And then pleomorphic means that they can take more than one arrangement. All right, so this is what we would be seeing. So again, the coccus is going to be a spherical shape or a circular shape. As you notice, the cocobacillus sort of creates a rod shape, but it's just a little bit more blunt. So it's kind of mixing the two together. A bacillus is what we'd consider to be a rod shape. The vibrio is comma-like shape. The spirillum, the spirochete are going to be those spiral components. And then again, pleomorphic means they can take on more than one arrangement. All right, and again, when we look at their arrangements, we can see how they are, how those shapes are sort of arranged together. You can see them as just one individual cell. So like with the first one, we'd just see the cocci, I apologize, the cocci in just one shape, or again, it could be in pairs, which we would consider to be diplo. You can see them in this streptococcus shape. So when we think about strep pyogenes, we would see that we have these spherical cells, but they're in a chain-like format. We can also see them in tetrads, which are groups of four. We can also see them in the sarcina-like shape, which they're going to be more cubed. And then staphylococcus, like Staphylococcus aureus, they're going to be in these grape-like clusters, and sort of these irregular clusters kind of clumped together. All right, same thing for the bacilli. We can see a single bacilli, which would just be that rod shape. We can see diplobacilli, where there's going to be two paired together. Strepto, they're in that chain. And then we can also see this palisade or this V shape as well. All right, another prokaryotic cell to discuss are archaea. Archaea are going to be very similar to bacteria. In fact, they actually have some similarities to eukaryotes as well. They are more primitive. They also lack a nucleus. They lack those membrane-bound organelles, but they're different from bacteria in the fact that their cell wall is not made up of peptidoglycan. And actually, even in their DNA, it's actually similar to eukaryotic cells in terms of their DNA and ribosomes. But they live in really extreme environments. So you'll find them in like hot springs, for instance. And we tend to talk about them being more primitive, but they are also a prokaryotic cell. Moving on to the eukaryotic microorganisms. Again, EU means true or good, and then kary means nucleus. So these guys do have a nucleus to hold their DNA, and they do have membrane-bound organelles. They again tend to be much bigger than prokaryotic cells, and they will have linear DNA that will have multiple chromosomes. Unlike with prokaryotes, they had a single chromosome, and usually it's in a circular shape when we talk about bacteria. The first guy that we'll talk about are the protists, which is going to be algae. Algae is going to be photosynthetic, meaning that it undergoes photosynthesis for its carbon source. It can be unicellular, so it can be one single cell, or it can have multiple cells. And their cell wall is going to be composed of cellulose. So they are plant-like, they are not plants. And again, they are photosynthetic. So if we were to think about algae, we could think about like red algae, or we could think about like a blue-green algae, for instance. And they usually are going to produce molecular oxygen as a byproduct of that photosynthesis. A part of the protists as well are protozoa. So if you hear the term protist, we're thinking of algae and protozoa. Protozoa are going to be single cell eukaryotes, and they're very similar to animal cells in their structure. They're actually classified based upon their locomotion and their reproductive techniques, but they usually will live freely in water, but some can live in animals as well. Some can produce sexually, some can produce asexually. And again, a lot of them are going to be classified by their mechanisms of locomotion, so how they're able to move. In your first image that you're going to see, we'll notice what are called pseudopoda or pseudopodia, and these are going to be false feet. So it kind of looks like they have little feet. You may hear about cilia, which are these little hair-like appendages around the cell, or some of them may have a flagella, which is a true tail, allowing for that locomotion. Next, we're going to talk about fungi. Fungi are eukaryotic as well. They are going to be heterotrophs, and that means they obtain food from other organisms, so they have to eat off of something else in order to obtain their food source. Their cell wall will be considered chitin, and so it looks like chitin. It is not. The true terminology is chitin. And we think about fungi, we'll be thinking about molds or yeast. Molds are going to be multicellular. They grow as these longer filaments, and they can produce sexually or asexually with utilizing spores. Same thing for mushrooms as well. They are also multicellular. Versus yeast are unicellular, and they produce by something called budding. You will actually see the little budding cells in the figure, the fourth figure down below, or they can also be produced by sexual spores as well. And again, we'll talk about these guys in more detail coming up. Next, we have our helminths, which are our parasitic worms. They are like an animal cell. They're multicellular. We can see that we have parasitic flatworms or roundworms that we'll discuss in more detail. And the reason that they are considered part of microbiology is because they are microscopic in certain stages of their life. So what we'll notice is we're going to talk about what are called an intermediate host or definitive host. And when they are in their larval cells or in their egg-like format, they're considered to be microscopic. So we're going to discuss like a tapeworm, we're going to discuss hookworms, pinworms, and even guinea worms as well. Now, we're also going to discuss viruses. Viruses are not part of eukaryotic. They're not actually eukaryotic or prokaryotic. In fact, viruses are not a living thing. They can't reproduce on their own, so they actually don't fall under any domain or kingdom. They are what we consider an obligate intracellular parasite, and they require a host for their machinery. They are actually pretty simple in their structure. They have some genetic material, and they may have a protein covering over top of them, and an additional envelope. But that's pretty much it. They do not have ribosomes. They do not have a proper nucleus. They don't have the organelles. And because of that, again, they don't have the necessary machinery to really reproduce on their own. And this is why they have to utilize a host cell. They are extremely small. This is why we won't be able to see them utilizing a light microscope, and that's why we need those electron microscopes in way more detail to actually see these viruses because they're just so unbelievably small. When we think about eukaryotes and prokaryotes, we're thinking more along the lines of micrometers. Viruses, we're thinking nanometers. They're very, very small. All right, so I hope this just gave you a great little survey. Again, we will be discussing all of these organisms in more detail. But again, just to sort of relay all the information, when we think about those living organisms, they can fall either under the domain bacteria or archaea, or we can see eukarya. The prokaryotes would be the bacteria and archaea domain, and anything that is eukaryotic would fall under the domain eukarya. So when we think about bacteria and archaea, remember they are going to be much smaller. They do not have that nucleus. They don't have those membrane-bound organelles. Versus eukarya, again, are going to be much larger. They will have that nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, and that's where we're going to see algae, protozoa, which are a protist, fungi, and then those parasitic worms called helminths. And then finally, we'll discuss viruses. Viruses are non-living, but they're very, very small, and they do have the capability to infect because they require a host cell to reproduce. We'll also discuss in more detail coming up prions and viroids, but that will be for a different chapter. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.